So last week, probably, I don't know when I'm releasing this, I released a video about what origin story you should pick. Because they're all very different and they are committing to a 30-hour long game, essentially. Fully voice acted, with cutscenes, dialogues, with choices, you name it. However, that was a topic in itself. You know what else is a topic in itself? Picking a combat style. Now, this used to be a lot simpler to talk about when the story and the class, the style, was one and the same, but it is not anymore. So you get to kind of pick, if you're a force user, between all of your relevant force using classes, styles, I hate their naming, and if you're a non-force user, oh dear god, look at this. It could look even just as crazy for the Force users as well, because you could also have access to the Jedi side, and that's really what a lot of this is. You're seeing the Jedi side version of things as well. That's why it looks more complicated. But we're going to go through these bit by bit, starting with the Sith. So let's start with the Force users, because it's simple. So, as either a warrior or an inquisitor, and you can get access to these also on the Jedi side, of course, you have Marauder, Juggernaut, Assassin, and Sorcerer, and all four of these can be different things. Let's talk about which one you should pick based on what their playstyles are. So, a Marauder, in pretty much every circumstance, is a DPS. I'm actually amazed they put this one at the top, but they do. This is essentially a DPS. Look, it's got two swords. You can be Kirito. It's mostly focused around like Ataru style attacks, if you know what that means. You're jumping around, you're swinging two lightsabers, doing a bunch of DPS, and this is a very good DPS class, even in endgame content, at least in my experience playing as every single class and what I've seen others playing and talk about. This is the epitome of the cool guy looking DPS class. It's hard to see under the lightsaber, but you have three different options here for DPS choices underneath your styles, right? You can either do direct damage, they call it. This is burst DPS. Damage over time, so you can have a dot-based kind of spec, and also hybrid damage if you want something in the middle. The burst DPS is kind of the most liked thing for this class, so if you like burst DPS and force users, Marauder is the way to go. Now, looking at the Juggernaut, this one's a little bit different. This is more stereotypical one lightsaber. It has three different options here. You have two that are dedicated to DPS. You have Rage and Vengeance. One is Burst. Anytime you see direct damage, that means Burst. This is a Burst DPS. This is a Dot DPS. The Burst DPS is generally more popular than the Dot DPS. However, in terms of tanking, a Juggernaut tank is definitely a very liked thing. It's like the default Force user thing. And everything I'm saying right now can apply to the Jedi side as well. We'll just talk about equivalents when we get there. So if you are playing a Juggernaut, this is a really good one for being a tank. And you can solo stuff quite easily as a tank in this game due to the companion system, allowing you to have your own personal healer or DPS follow you around. An Assassin is where we start getting towards our more stealth-based classes here. As you see, they all highlight stealth next to melee. You have your Dot, your Burst DPS, and your, that's right, tank. And now this is actually a surprising, like a really popular tank, because unlike most games, they took the stealth, the rogue class. That's kind of what the Assassin is. It's a rogue class that you can pick between. And of course, Burst DPS tends to be more popular than Dot, but they gave it an ability to tank, and it's been surprisingly popular in not only endgame content, but overall in player choice as well. It is a surprisingly useful tank, seeing as that they use lighter armor than, say, the Juggernaut would use. It is pretty good. It holds up actually pretty well in all kinds of content. In this game, there isn't really very much min-maxing. It's more of just a player preference. Just note that even your tanking is based around stealth. This is where we start to diverge, because Marauder was just like a warrior that does damage. Juggernaut was a warrior that can do damage or tank. And once you get to assassin, which is essentially a rogue, you have a choice, do damage or tank, but all of them will be stealth based to some extent, and they will be very force ability based. You'll be throwing stuff, using electricity. For DPS, you're gonna be squishier than something like a Marauder. For tanking, you will be squishier than a Juggernaut, but you'll have ways to counteract that. You have a lot of skills that will make you more survivable, even if your overall armor and stats aren't technically as survivable as a Juggernaut, where you have the more stereotypical RPG tank, MMORPG warrior tank. And then going over to Sorcerer here, we have still DPS. This is kind of our ranged DPS, and you have a dot or burst choice. And you have a healer option. This is where we finally get our healer. So you have to go to Sorcerer if you want to have a force-based healer. If you do have a force-based healer, this is the only way to get one. You don't have two different options like you do for tanks here. So plenty of DPS options on the force side of things. Here's where we have our healer. Again, no other choice, so I can't really say one is better than the other. Like, I can highlight the differences between a Juggernaut and an Assassin. All of these DPSs kind of played sort of similar, but I did highlight their differences. Marauders, just beat them up. Juggernaut, even simpler, less complicated. It's definitely the simpler one. Assassin, you're a rogue, you'll be more stealth based, and this is the range stuff. The range stuff is generally weaker no matter what than the up close melee stuff is, but it's completely viable, and you're not going to get like kicked from parties or anything for picking it. But now let's look over here at the non-force user stuff, where it gets a little more complicated. So to start, we have the Mercenary, originally tied to the Bounty Hunter class story. This is quite interesting because it sounds almost like a tank in practice, but you don't have a tank option for this. You actually have your first non-force user right here. You have a heal that you can be. So if you want to be a non-force user, either range, DPS, and this is like one of the more simple ones. You have two blasters, you go pew pew from a distance, and you could toss out some heals to your friends. Very simple gameplay. Mercenary, this is what you want to pick. Because then moving on to the power tech, we get a little bit different. So this isn't even ranged. He may have a gun, but he's not a range class. He is, and it specifies here, melee. You may have a gun, but all of your abilities are going to be really, really close up. And once again, burst versus dot, DPS options. I could repeat the whole time which one's more popular. You probably figure it out by now. But I'll tell you, for power tech, the whole fire thing is kind of well liked. This is where you can tank as well. It's why this is more melee based to begin with compared to the Mercenary, which is ranged and has the heals. You see, they like putting the healer to be something that's already range based to begin with, whereas the power tech here, melee based. Just like if we jumped back over to the Assassin, we have very close melee stealth. Well, these are all melee to be fair, but the simplest classes being up close like that. Then moving on to what would have been the Imperial Agent, we have the Sniper. This is like the NFU, non-force user version of your Marauder. It's based on range DPS. However, I will say the DPS of the Sniper really, no matter which one you pick, does not keep up with Marauder or most other DPSs in the game. No one's really going to fault you for bringing it. But out of every single class in the game, the only one I've ever seen shit talked over 2,000 hours for DPS is the Sniper. The Sniper is unique because it's ranged and it's not like a Marauder. It doesn't really jump into combat. The Marauder likes jumping in. Like I said, it's a Taru base. You're jumping around a lot. You can jump into combat and between enemies. The Bounty Hunter Sniper here, for example, has cover it can deploy. You deploy this cover, you sit behind it and you shoot. And instead of a lot of instant cast things, it's more like you use a charge shot, you wait a couple seconds, and then it fires, and then you pick the next thing. Instead of like seeing an animation go and then you click the thing, it's definitely the most different because you have to, instead of instant cast and then use your next ability when the cooldown runs out, or use a cast, wait for the animation to run out, use your next attack. With the Sniper, and this is the only one I've seen that really does this, you use an attack, you wait for the cooldown. The animation hasn't even started yet for the attack. And then right when that cooldown is up, you input your next attack while the cooldown for the attack you just did finally starts playing out. It's really hard to synchronize my brain with, and the DPS is a lot lower than other classes. It tends to be more about exploiting enemy weak points than anything else, and just staying safe behind cover. Additionally, this is a little bit of a buggy game. There are some instances where the classes that stay behind cover actually can cause some bugs in storytelling and break encounters. This is very, very rare, but I have seen it more than one time. So I will throw that out there. So maybe I wouldn't recommend Sniper too much. It didn't fit what I wanted as someone that likes long range combat at all. But then moving on to the Operative, once again, this one's really interesting because you see it's also melee, just like the Power Tech. This is your non-force user variant of the Rogue. This is where you get your stealth. However, as we might compare, we actually have more options here for healers. You see, we only really had the one tank option for non-force users, but it's flipped here. We have 2 heal options for our non-force users here. This is where the Operative can actually be more range-based because you have what's supposed to kind of be like an assault rifle right here that you use. There's direct damage and some dots that you can use, but do remember, no matter what you're equipping, you are still melee focused, just like the Power Tech was. It's weird to get used to, but at least we're back to our normal gameplay of not having to wait for things to queue up in a weird, unsynchronized way. If you want to be a healer, your choices are going to be between the Mercenary and the Operative. I would say the Mercenary is simpler to play, only because, it's like the Juggernaut. It's just that simple, direct deal. The Operative's the stealth-based one, and it doesn't have the force-based abilities. It's more about, for example, damage like poisons, things like that. It's definitely the better Rogue option. So if you want the Rogue playstyle and you want to heal and you're okay with being a non-force user, this is where you go. But otherwise, it's going to be a lot simpler as a non-force user to heal if you are a Mercenary. The rest of these are all Republic classes. So we're going to swap over to the Republic to talk about those. So Guardian, this is the Juggernaut. 1-to-1. Like, we're basically just be matching from this point onwards. The Guardian is 1-to-1 the Juggernaut. Everything I said about the Juggernaut applies here. It is literally the same class, but with different animations. That is it. Sentinel. This is the Marauder with different animations. That is it. The skills are the exact same. The Shadow is the Assassin 1-to-1 with different animations. That's it. Sage is the Sorcerer with different animations. That's it. Glad we've covered that. Now, when we get to the NFUs, moving on to the non-force users, the Gunslinger, despite having 2 pistols, is your equivalent of the Sniper. It's really strange, but it's just as desynced and weird. It's how it works. Even though they don't look the same, they act exactly the same. Looking over at Scoundrel, this is your copy and paste of the Operative. Works pretty much exactly the same, and it actually looks the same, so it won't even feel any, confusing at all. The Commando, this is your equivalent of the Mercenary, and your Vanguard is your equivalent of the Power Tech. So once again, Vanguard is your melee with the ability to tank. Commando is your ranged DPS or ranged healer. Scoundrel is your melee that has ranged weapons that can also be a healer. And then Gunslinger is that weird desynchronized ranged DPS that doesn't have a lot of DPS, but gets to hide behind cover and stay safe. Cover that it can deploy pretty much anywhere, by the way, or otherwise hide behind cover in the environment, though that is rarely as useful, sometimes needing to move to and from cover. And so those are all the combat styles and how they play and how they work. Generally, all the tanks seem roughly the same from what I've experienced in endgame content. I've never seen any really be highlighted as ultra better. They're so limited that they're kind of better for different things, honestly. The healers get roughly valued the same. Some of them, like the force using ones, could be slightly better at different things as well. For melee DPS, I never saw anyone really top the Marauder Sentinel. It was really the best. But all DPS will be roughly comparable. The sniper gunslinger is just going to have the most problems generally because you'll have to move for mechanics. You're very static of a DPS, whereas all the rest of them are very, very mobile. But one thing to remember is as you go up in level, if you're a subscriber, you can have 2 combat styles of either force user or non-force user, depending on what origin story you pick. So you don't have to pick just one. You can pick 2 of these styles, not like DPS or tank as a guardian, for example, but like I can be a guardian and a sage, so I have access to DPS, tanking, and healing all together. That much is possible. Or even like a shadow and a sage, so the gameplay is a little more, it's a little similar to each other, but you still have the full trinity available to you. So if you're a subscriber, you could do this. If you're not a subscriber, you only get one. Something to keep in mind. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. Feel free to ask me any questions you might have in the comments below. For now, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.